Welcome, Hans Kristensen.
Thank you.
You're Associate Senior Fellow with us at SIPRI, and you're also the Director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists.
That's correct. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and if we look at the nuclear picture in the world, the current facts which SIPRI presented as recently as in June this year, our latest figures count a total estimate of 12,512 warheads in the world. And we also state that of those, over 3,800 are, as we say, deployed with missiles and aircraft. And then of those, again, 2,000, we say, are on high alert. What does that mean? How is the situation with these?
Right. It means there are countries, 9 countries on the planet that have an enormous amount of nuclear weapons combined, but only a portion of them are sort of available for more quick use if you want to. Most of those, of course, are sort of on missiles and bases and in the militaries where they're supposed to be able to use them relatively quickly. And a smaller number of that are on missiles that are on particularly high alert, 2,000s of approximately. And they can actually be launched within just 5 to 15 minutes, depending on what kind of platform we're talking about.
And what is this particularly high alert platform in that case?
Yeah, so for example, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Mm-hmm. These are the big missiles in the silos in the ground or on road mobile trucks. They can reach to the other side of the Atlantic or Pacific, depending on who you are. And they're standing there ready with their nuclear warheads on them, so that if anybody authorizes and they press the button, they can reach their targets within, depending on where you launch them from, 12 to 30 minutes.
Mm. And I think in that context, we also distinguish between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons.
Yeah, tactical is sort of kind of a name we used to use during the Cold War, when tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons were shorter range weapons that were used for local wars, so to speak. Today, tactical means sort of not strategic, not long range strategic. So they're used for, covering targets that are in the region around a country, and are not necessarily going to be used sooner, but they can be used sooner than strategic. And so the idea is, if you start with these shorter range weapons, it's a limited conflict relatively, and you still have to go through a number of steps before you get to the big one, so to speak. So there is some of that, but all weapons, whether they are long range or short range, are really, when we talk about nuclear weapons, they are all strategic in their nature.
Obviously, in all of this, there's a political dimension, and not at least as early on in the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. President Putin said in March 2022 that he ordered to move his forces to what he said, a special regime of combat duty. Mm-hmm. What was that exactly in that situation?
Well, apparently, yes, not very much. It was more about manning certain stations in a different way. It wasn't really something that affected what the nuclear forces themselves were doing and where they were deployed. And that has really characterized the Russian threats. They have been very in your face, and of course threatening. But we haven't yet seen actual changes in the way they operate their nuclear forces that sort of suggest that they're doing something different because of those threats. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that yes, we have a dangerous international situation with the war in Ukraine, and nuclear threats have been issued, but those are not threats that are about an imminent threat of nuclear weapons use. I think a number of things would still have to happen before you get to the point of nuclear use.
Mm. It's of course a big concern right now, especially for the European countries. There's a discussion of having, again, nuclear weapons placed on more European countries' territory. How do you judge that situation?
Yeah, every time you're in a dense military and political crisis, ideas come up about how to increase your signaling, your deterrence posture, your how unified you are. You have to express that in some shape or form. So different people in different communities that are part of this debate, they come up with ideas once in a while and recommend this. So far, there's not a whole lot of appetite in Western Europe for sort of significantly changing the nuclear posture in Europe. We are seeing some modifications and some changes, but it's not like a big shift compared to just a few years ago. But it is part of a development that can continue. And so we can't predict, of course, a year, 2, 3 years down the line, how will these steps we're taking today and the Russians are taking today, how would they result in other new initiatives, new weapon systems, what have you down the line? So this is one of the problems and the unpredictable results of international crises, that it starts a dynamic, and that dynamic can produce new situations. And we used to have one of those in the past. It was called the Cold War, and it took about 40 years to get out of it. Now we're back in that kind of loop.
And it seems that rhetoric plays a strong role, and also that Europe is not even the only area, of course, where this plays a role. I'm thinking also in the situation between Pakistan and India, for instance.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that in that context it's nearly a bit of a race situation of nuclear warheads?
Yes, it varies tremendously from region to region. We have sort of a hot spot in Europe now because of this, and India-Pakistan has a long history of their own border skirmishes that can lead to escalation into potentially nuclear scenarios. We have a tense situation on the Korean Peninsula, North and South, and Americans backing up the South, of course, and we have a tense situation growing between the United States and China. And so, we're really seeing the nuclear landscape and temperature changing very rapidly. And so, but if you ask me, what is my concern about nuclear use risk? My concern is not that tomorrow we'll wake up and some country will decide, let's fire some nuclear weapons. It's not going to come out of the blue. It is going to grow out of a conflict, a conventional conflict most likely, that evolves and it gradually escalates to the point where a country says, we need to use nuclear weapons for whatever reason. So a number of steps have to be taken first before we see this. But there are a lot of dynamics underway in full swing. And when you have a war, a large-scale war, those steps can happen quicker.
And one element next to the rhetoric is states modernize what they have.
Very, very, very busy modernization schedules everywhere in the world. All the nuclear weapon states have realized that the idea of elimination of nuclear weapons is not in the cards. So instead of planning for the elimination of nuclear weapons, they're planning for the indefinite extension of nuclear arsenals, in significant sized nuclear arsenals. So this is a completely different shift compared to just 15 years ago, where the international community was focused on the idea that you reduce numbers, reduce the role, you pave the way down to deep cuts and eventually elimination of nuclear weapons. Not anymore. Now we're back in a Cold War. That day may come back where we can, where countries will begin to adjust their postures downward toward elimination. But right now they're all busy extending nuclear air.
How in particular are you concerned about the capabilities of North Korea?
Yeah, the North Korean situation is very tense. They're officially still at war. They have a sort of a peace agreement or an armistice where they are not actively fighting each other, but the war is not officially over. That started in the 50s. It's an insane situation. And recently, of course, the North Koreans have developed significant nuclear capabilities, both long range and shorter range. Right now, most recently, they have presented ideas and plans for what they describe are tactical nuclear weapons. shorter range weapons that they envision would be used earlier on in a conflict, before you use the bigger systems. So in a way, they're doing what they've seen the Russians and the United States do over many, many decades. They're sort of mimicking their kind of posturing. But with that comes new risks that these weapons would actually be used in a crisis. And so this is very disconcerting and a real challenge for the North Koreans, the Americans, and the South Koreans, how to manage this more complicated nuclear relationship in the next decade.
What is your biggest concern in all of this?
The biggest concern is that we get ourselves, I mean the powers that play in this nuclear competition, that we get ourselves into a corner because of the instinct to take more and more steps and be more and more in each other's face, that we box ourselves in, so that at some point a leader will have to decide to use nuclear weapons. Everything we do should try to move us further away from that corner, so that we have options that do not involve and put us in a position where we have to use nuclear weapons.